There are twists of fate that don't just hurt, they transform. Thus began the fall of Rebecca Collins, a woman betrayed by the world, abandoned by the man who promised to love her, and judged by a society that valued only her last name. With 3 children in her arms and her life in ashes, no one, not even her, imagined that this humiliation would be the beginning of something much bigger. Rebecca Collins faced the bill on the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she held the crumpled paper. "I can't go on with this life. I wasn't born to be a father or a husband. Don't look for me. Goodbye." Nathan's cold, hastily typed words echoed in her mind like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The world around her seemed out of focus, as if she'd suddenly entered a parallel dimension where nothing made sense. That morning had started, like any other. She made breakfast for the children while humming absent-mindedly, organized their school lunches, and kissed Nathan before he left, supposedly headed to the office. There were no signs, no clues about the bomb that was about to explode in her perfectly orchestrated suburban life. 6-year-old Lily tugged at the hem of her skirt, her blue eyes, identical to her father's, shining with unshed tears. "Mom, when's Dad coming back?" she asked with that fragile innocence that makes a mother's heart ache. Rebecca swallowed the lump in her throat, unable to respond as 3-year-old twins Oliver and Emma played innocently on the living room rug, oblivious to the storm that had just devastated their lives. How could she explain to a 6-year-old that her father had decided they weren't enough, that he had discarded them like someone discarding a suit that's no longer in style? It was an ordinary Wednesday, or it should have been, until she discovered that Nathan had emptied their joint account, taken her passport, and disappeared, leaving her with 3 young children, a mortgage arrears, and mountains of hidden debt that, until that moment, she was completely unaware of. The phone rang, pulling her out of her stupor. It was her mother-in-law, Vivian Collins. "Rebecca, I just found out. Nathan called me from the airport." Vivian's normally controlled voice was tense, with that tone she used when something threatened the perfect family facade. "I'm on my way. We need to talk." Rebecca wanted to laugh hysterically. Of course, Nathan had contacted her mother before disappearing. The Collins family's loyalty had always been to themselves, never to outsiders. And she, despite 7 years of marriage and 3 children, remained a stranger to the clan. An hour later, Rebecca sat stiffly on the worn sofa, facing Vivian and her father-in-law, Richard Collins, who regarded her with a mixture of pity and barely concealed contempt. The couple's intimidating elegance contrasted painfully with the modest living room, which now seemed even more insignificant beneath their appraising gazes. "We always knew you weren't good enough for our son," Vivian stated coldly, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle in her designer skirt. "A waitress from a small no-name town. What future could you possibly offer him?" The words smacked like precise darts. Rebecca had struggled for years to prove herself worthy of the Collins name, to fit into a world of privilege and crushing expectations. She had sacrificed her own ambitions, tolerated condescending remarks, and agreed to be molded into the acceptable daughter-in-law the family needed. All in vain. "I loved him," Rebecca replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the emotional turmoil inside her. "And he abandoned me. He abandoned us." Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive glasses with that characteristic gesture that preceded his most calculated statements. "Let's get straight to the point. Nathan made a deplorable decision, but we have a reputation to uphold." His tone was the same one he used in corporate meetings, cold and pragmatic. "We offer a settlement, a monthly sum for child support, on the condition that you never mention the circumstances of Nathan's estrangement." "Estrangement?" Rebecca repeated incredulously, indignation growing inside her. "He abandoned us. He emptied our accounts. He left 3 children without a father." "Moderate your tone," Vivian warned, her aristocratic features contorting in distaste. "We're being generous. Alternatively, we could file a custody petition. After all, what judge would award custody to a mother with no resources, no hire? Education, And no means to support 3 children? Rebecca's blood ran cold. The implications of that veiled threat pierced the fog of shock and pain. You wouldn't do that. We would do whatever was necessary to protect the Collins family legacy, Richard replied calmly, placing a document on the coffee table. Sign here, agree to our terms, and we'll all move forward. Rebecca looked at the twins sleeping on the small couch and at Lily, who was coloring quietly in the corner, trying to make herself invisible during the tense conversation. All 3 of them had Collins' blood in their veins, but in that moment, Rebecca realized that for Richard and Vivian, that was the only thing of value about them. They were extensions of the family line, pawns in a game of appearances and power. How much? He finally asked, feeling the bitter taste of defeat. $2,000 a month. Generous, considering your situation. Rebecca almost laughed. $2,000 to raise 3 children in one of the most expensive cities in the country. To pay the mortgage on the house Nathan had insisted on buying in a suitable neighborhood. To cover the debts he'd hidden from her. Debts that now threatened to drown her. What if I refuse? Vivian's smile was icy, the kind of smile vipers might offer just before attacking. Then you'll discover how difficult it is to fight against one of the most influential families in the state. Rebecca felt the weight of powerlessness weighing on her shoulders. This wasn't just a legal battle she was facing. It was a war that encompassed every aspect of her life. The Collinses had connections. Everywhere, in the courts, in the schools, in social circles. They could destroy her with terrifying ease. As she stared at the document in front of her, an unexpected thought crossed her mind. Nathan had never been the strong, independent man she'd believed himself to be. He was a puppet in his parents' hands, unable to cut the strings that controlled him. Hadn't she herself been a puppet, dancing to the Collins' tune? With a sudden clarity that contrasted with the chaos of the past few hours, Rebecca understood that this was a turning point. She could submit once more, accept the crumbs offered to her, and live under the constant shadow of their threat. Or she could start fighting even though the odds were overwhelmingly against her. She took the pen Richard offered her, feeling its weight as if it were a weapon. "I'll need time to consult with a lawyer," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her tone. Vivian's expression darkened. "There's no need to involve lawyers, dear. This is a family matter." "I'm not part of your family anymore, am I?" Rebecca replied, a flash of fire lighting her eyes. "You just made it very clear. So this is a legal matter and I need legal advice." Richard and Vivian exchanged a look, that silent communication honed over decades of calculated marriage. "You have 48 hours, Richard finally conceded, rising with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to dictating terms, not negotiating them. "After that, we'll be forced to take more decisive action." When the door closed behind them, Rebecca remained motionless, absorbing the silence they left in their wake. Lily approached cautiously, her small footsteps barely audible on the carpet. "Are the grandparents angry with me, Mom?" she asked, her small voice cracking. Rebecca pulled her daughter toward her, hugging her with the protective fierceness that only a cornered mother can feel. "No, honey, they're not angry with you. They're sad like all of us." It was a white lie, but a necessary one. How could you explain to a little girl that her grandparents saw her as a chess piece in a family power game? That her own father had decided her freedom was worth more than watching her grow up? "Is Dad coming back?" Lily insisted, her eyes searching her mother's for the truth. Rebecca stroked her daughter's hair, so similar to Nathan's in its golden brown color, and breathed deeply. No more lies, but no more truths that could break a child's heart. "Your dad needs time for himself now, Lily. We don't know when he'll be back, but what I do know is that you, Oliver, Emma, and I will be together. Always." Holding her daughter, Rebecca looked around the room, seeing clearly for the first time what she had previously ignored. The family photographs where Nathan always seemed slightly distant. The decor chosen to impress his friends, rather, than create a warm home. the small signs of a life built on appearances rather than authenticity. Something crystallized inside her at that moment, a core of resolve she hadn't known she possessed. The Collinses had underestimated something fundamental. She had never before had to fight for her survival. Now that her children were at stake, they would discover exactly what Rebecca Collins was made of. 3 weeks after Nathan's abandonment, Rebecca was pushing her shopping cart around the local supermarket, mentally calculating each item before placing it in the cart. Her life had transformed into an endless sequence of agonizing calculations. How much each meal cost, how to stretch the money to the end of the month, how to pay the bills that relentlessly arrived. She had accepted the Collins agreement, not out of fear, but out of strategy. She needed to buy time while she looked for better employment than her current part-time job at the local cafe. With the help of a pro bono lawyer she had found through a women's support center, she had managed to negotiate some modifications to the original document. The Collins could not seek custody unless she seriously breached her parental duties, and financial support was guaranteed for a minimum of 5 years. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't the total surrender they'd hoped for. It was a tense armistice that gave them room to breathe and plan. Fatigue had become her constant companion. Between taking care of the children, working at the cafe, searching for better-paying jobs, and learning how to manage the finances Nathan had always controlled, she barely had time to sleep. The dark circles under her eyes silently told the story of nights spent crunching numbers and crying in the shower so the children wouldn't hear her. Rebecca Collins. A familiar voice made her turn. Sandra Pierce, the self-proclaimed queen of the social circle of wives Rebecca had tried in vain to join over the past few years, watched her with curious eyes, accompanied by 2 of her equally elegant friends. The 3 women looked like they'd just stepped out of a beauty salon, with their perfect locks and impeccable manicures. I heard rumors, but I didn't want to believe them, Sandra continued, her false friendliness as transparent as the plastic wrapping the expensive fruit Rebecca could no longer afford. Nathan really left? Rebecca squared her shoulders, forcing herself to maintain a dignified appearance despite her embarrassment at being seen in her current state, in worn clothes, without makeup, and clearly counting every penny. Yes, he left us, he replied tersely, resisting the urge to add details that would make Nathan's departure less heroic. How terrible, Sandra exclaimed, though her tone suggested more fascination than empathy. Her eyes quickly scanned Rebecca, taking in every sign of deterioration in her appearance. And now, how are you going to support the children? I always found it admirable how you tried to fit into our circle despite your origins. The other women barely hid their smiles, and Rebecca felt the heat of humiliation rise up her neck. For years she'd endured similar comments, subtle reminders that no matter how hard she tried, she'd always be the town waitress lucky enough to snag a Collins. She'd endured with a smile, convincing herself they'd eventually accept her. Now she saw the truth with painful clarity. She'd never been part of the group. She was just a sideshow, a curiosity, living proof that even a Collins could make a mistake. "We're adapting," he replied curtly, trying to end the conversation as quickly as possible. Sandra looked at Rebecca's cart, noticing the basic, inexpensive foods, so different from the gourmet delicacies she used to buy when the Collinses paid the bills. "Well, if you need any used clothes for the kids, I'm cleaning out Bradley Jr.'s closets. I can separate some pieces." Patronizing charity was worse than open contempt. Rebecca gritted her teeth, reminding herself that her pride wouldn't feed her children. Still, something inside her rebelled at the idea of depending on Sandra Pierce's leftovers. Before Rebecca could answer, Sandra's cell phone rang. Seeing the name on the screen, her eyes widened with excitement. "It's Vivian Collins." Taking a few steps back, Sandra answered the call, but not before giving her friends a meaningful look. Rebecca stood motionless, her heart racing. Was her mother-in-law calling Sandra? Why? Minutes later, Sandra returned, her face a mask of false sympathy. "My dear, Vivian just told me that Nathan is in Europe on important business. She asked me to ensure the community knows that you and the children are being supported financially during this temporary separation. Rebecca paled. So that was it. The Collinses were fabricating a story to protect their son's reputation, transforming his cowardly abandonment into a respectable professional absence. Temporary separation, he repeated, the bitter taste of the lie on his tongue. Yes, and don't worry, Sandra continued, placing a hand on his arm with a familiarity she'd never shown before. We'll make sure everyone knows you're not really in. Vivian mentioned that you're being very generous. Outrage grew within Rebecca. Not only were they trying to rewrite the narrative of her life, but they were also controlling how others would perceive her. As a woman supported by the charity of her husband's family, not as a victim of abandonment struggling to survive. Have to go, she said abruptly, leaving the cart in the aisle and heading for the exit, tears threatening to fall. In the parking lot, sitting in her aging car, Rebecca finally allowed the tears to flow. Not because of Nathan's abandonment, that pain had already been processed, but because of the calculated humiliation the Collinses were inflicting. She felt powerless, trapped in a narrative controlled by others, unable to stand up for her own truth. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from a coworker, sharing a link to a news story. Collins Enterprises heir accepts executive position at European subsidiary. The photo showed Nathan, smiling, standing next to an elegant blonde woman in front of the Eiffel Tower. His radiant face showed no hint of guilt or remorse for the family he had abandoned. Rebecca stared at the image, cold rage replacing the sadness. The betrayal ran even deeper than she'd imagined. Not only had he abandoned her, but he'd meticulously planned their new life while sharing a bed with her, while kissing their children every night, while promising that things would improve financially. Soon that's when she made a decision. She wouldn't be a victim in the story the Collinses were writing. She would find a way not only to survive, but to thrive, for herself and her children. With trembling but determined hands, she wiped the tears from her face and started the engine. She had a job interview that afternoon at a small publishing house that didn't pay much, but would allow her to work while the twins were in preschool. It was a start, a small step toward independence. What Rebecca didn't know as she drove away from the supermarket was that, a few blocks away, a sleek black car remained parked. Inside, a man in an impeccable suit watched her departure with calculated interest, while talking on his phone. Yes, I just confirmed it personally. The situation is exactly as we suspected, Gabriel Donovan said, his gray eyes following Rebecca's old sedan until it disappeared into the traffic. Proceed with the next phase of the plan. The following days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Rebecca had established a precarious but functional routine. After dropping Lily off at school and the twins at the subsidized preschool she'd found, she worked at the cafe until noon. Then she'd rush to the publishing house where she'd gotten an editorial assistant position and work until it was time to pick up the children. Her evenings were spent helping Lily with her homework, bathing the twins, and once everyone was asleep, reviewing freelance manuscripts that supplemented her income. The fatigue was like a physical presence, a constant weight on his shoulders. But there was also something else, a growing pride in his ability to face adversities he never imagined he'd have to confront. One evening, while she was preparing dinner with the limited ingredients she could afford, the doorbell rang. When she opened the door, she found Richard Collins standing there, as impeccably dressed as ever, but with an expression she couldn't immediately decipher. "May I come in?" he asked with that formality that was as much a part of him as his gold. "Watch." Rebecca hesitated. The Collinses' visits never brought anything good, but rejecting him could have consequences she wasn't prepared to face. "The kids are about to have dinner," he replied, neither accepting nor rejecting directly. "I won't take much of your time," he insisted, and something in his tone, was it vulnerability, made her give in. Once in the living room, Richard looked around the space appraisingly. Rebecca knew what she saw: worn furniture, repaired toys, obvious signs of a constant financial struggle. Despite her efforts to keep the house clean and cozy, the shortages were evident in every corner. "Nathan has filed for divorce," Richard announced without preamble. "The papers will arrive tomorrow." Rebecca nodded slowly. It was to be expected, although the formalization of the abandonment still hurt in ways she hadn't anticipated. "Anything else?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. Richard looked uncomfortable, a rare state for a man accustomed to controlling every situation. "He wants full custody of the children." The words fell like a bomb in the small space. Rebecca felt the air leave her lungs. "What?" The word came out as a strangled whisper. "Your lawyer will argue that your financial situation isn't adequate for raising 3 children, and that with your new income in Europe, you can offer them a stable and privileged life." The room seemed to spin around Rebecca. This was worse than abandonment, worse than public humiliation. It was an attempt to rob her of the only thing that gave her the strength to keep going each day, her children. "You can't do that," he finally managed to say. "He abandoned them. He hasn't even called to check on them in 4 months." Richard had the decency to look embarrassed, if only fleetingly. "The courts consider current circumstances, not past ones, and right now he can offer financial stability, private education, opportunities that you simply can't provide." "Why?" The question welled up from deep within her. "Why now? Why do you want to take my children away from me when you haven't even bothered to contact them?" Richard adjusted his glasses, that familiar gesture he used to buy himself time when he felt cornered. "It's not him who wants it, Rebecca. It's Vivian." The revelation shouldn't have surprised her, but it did. "Does your wife want to take my children away from me?" Vivian believes children should grow up like Collins, with the privileges and connections that come with the name. She's convinced Nathan that it's the best thing for them. Rebecca let out a humorless laugh. "Nathan always does what Mommy says, doesn't he? Even abandoning his family." To his surprise, Richard didn't defend his son. Instead, he looked toward the kitchen where the children were patiently waiting for their dinner. "I don't agree with this," he finally said, his voice lower and less authoritarian than ever. "Children need their mother." Rebecca looked at him in astonishment. She had never seen Richard Collins openly contradict his wife or show any signs of family dissent. "Why are you telling me this?" Richard seemed to age 10 years before her eyes. "Because I know what it's like to grow up without a mother who loves you unconditionally. My mother died when I was 6, barely older than Lily. My father hired nannies and sent me to boarding schools, but it was never the same." It was the first time Richard had shared anything personal with her. During 7 years of marriage to his son, he had maintained a polite but unbridgeable distance. "I'm sorry," Rebecca offered genuinely, despite everything. "I brought this for you," Richard said, handing her an envelope. "It's Martin Greenberg's address. He's the best family lawyer in the state, and he owes me some favors. Tell him you're coming from me." Rebecca looked at the envelope in disbelief. "Why would you help me fight your own son and wife?" Richard's gaze shifted back to the kitchen, where the twins' innocent laughter could be heard. "Because in 50 years of marriage to Vivian, I've learned to recognize when to fight her battles and when to step aside. This is one battle she shouldn't win." He stood, smoothing out non-existent wrinkles in his suit. "I won't mention this visit, and I suggest you do the same. Martin will help you better if Vivian doesn't know he's involved." When the door closed behind Richard, Rebecca stood motionless, the envelope in her hands like an unexpected lifeline in the storm. For the first time in months, she felt something dangerously close to hope. What she didn't know was that her custody battle was about to become the catalyst for much bigger changes in her life. Changes that not even Richard Collins, with all his influence and foresight, could have anticipated.